I was standing in my kitchen when my husband told me he was leaving. The twins were barely 6 months old at the time. One of them was crying in the living room. The other was asleep in the bassinet beside the couch. The house smelled like warm formula and the lavender detergent I used on their tiny clothes. It was the kind of quiet, ordinary evening that mothers of newborns know well. Tired, a little chaotic, but full of small routines. And then he said it. I can't do this anymore. Just like that. No raised voice. No argument. Just a flat sentence dropped into the middle of the room like something heavy. For a moment I thought he meant the sleepless nights. The diapers. The constant noise. New parenthood has a way of overwhelming people, especially when 2 babies arrive at once. I remember wiping my hands on a dish towel and asking him what he meant. He didn't look at me. He was staring at the floor. I'm leaving, he said again. That was the moment my world split in two. One half of me was still standing there in the kitchen, trying to understand the words. The other half was already somewhere else, somewhere colder, watching everything happen like a scene in a movie. Because when you've been married long enough, you know the difference between someone who's upset and someone who has already made a decision. And my husband had already decided. The strange thing is, my first thought wasn't about myself. It was about the babies. Twin boys. Noah and Caleb. They had his dark hair and my father's stubborn little chin. They were the kind of babies strangers would stop to admire in grocery stores. Tiny, curious, always kicking their legs like they were already impatient to grow up. They didn't understand anything about the adult world yet. All they knew was warmth, milk, the sound of my voice, and the sound of their father's voice. At least, until that night. Are you serious? I asked quietly. He nodded. No explanation. No anger. Just distance. Like he had already stepped out of the life we built together. I'll send money, he added quickly, as if that solved something. Money. I remember thinking how strange it was that he thought money would fix the sound of 2 babies crying at 3 in the morning when there's no one else in the house to help you. Or the silence that follows when someone walks out of a marriage without even trying to fight for it. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. What about your sons? For the first time that night, he hesitated. Just a little. But it was long enough for me to see something flicker across his face, something like doubt. Then it disappeared. They'll be fine with you, he said. Those words landed harder than anything else he'd said. They'll be fine with you. Not with us. With me. I wish I could tell you I argued. That I begged. That I demanded answers. But the truth is, when a person has already emotionally packed their bags, no conversation in the world is going to bring them back. So instead, I just stood there and watched the man I had spent 10 years of my life with walk out of the front door. The babies started crying a few minutes later. Both of them. Anyone who has raised twins knows that sometimes it feels like they can sense each other's emotions. If one cries, the other often follows. I walked into the living room and picked them up, one in each arm. They were so small back then. Noah was fussing, his tiny face red. Caleb was still half asleep, confused by the noise. I held them close and rocked gently. It's okay, I whispered. But the truth was, I wasn't sure it was. Later that night, after the house finally went quiet, I sat on the couch with both boys asleep against my chest. The television was on, but I wasn't really watching it. My mind kept replaying the evening over and over again. Every word, every expression, every strange detail. And that's when I remembered something. My mother-in-law had called him earlier that day. For now, to understand why that detail matters, you need to know something about my husband's mother. Linda had never liked me. She was polite in public. The kind of woman who smiled at church gatherings and brought expensive desserts to family dinners. But beneath that surface, there was always something colder. Something calculating. From the very beginning of my marriage, she made it clear, subtly, of course, that she believed her son could have done better. Better background, better family, better status. Not once did she say those exact words out loud. But mothers like Linda don't need to. They say everything through small comments. Little sighs. Carefully chosen silence. Underscore. I remembered one dinner in particular, years earlier. We had just announced that I was pregnant with twins. My husband was overjoyed. He hugged me in the middle of the restaurant like we were teenagers again. But Linda, she barely reacted. Instead, she sipped her wine and said something I didn't fully understand at the time. Well, she said calmly, life has a way of testing people. Testing people. At the time, I assumed she meant the challenges of raising twins. Now, years later, I'm not so sure. Underscore that night. After my husband left, I checked my phone. There was one message from him. Just 4 words. I'll come tomorrow. No explanation. No apology. Just a promise to return for his things. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I looked down at my son sleeping beside me, and something inside me shifted. Because even though I didn't understand what had just happened, something about the whole situation felt wrong. Too sudden, too clean, too planned. And for the first time, a quiet thought crossed my mind. What if my husband didn't come up with this idea on his own? What if someone had helped him make that decision? At the time, I didn't have any proof. Only a feeling. A small, uncomfortable feeling sitting in the back of my mind. The kind that whispers when everything else goes quiet. I didn't know it yet. But years later, when the truth finally came out, when my husband saw me and our twins on television and realized what had really happened, that feeling would turn out to be right. His mother hadn't just disapproved of our marriage. She had been planning its end. For a very long time. The next morning came too quickly. I hadn't really slept. Anyone who has cared for newborn twins knows that sleep comes in fragments. 20 minutes here, maybe 40 minutes there if you're lucky. That night it was even worse. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the moment my husband walked out the door. The way he didn't look back. The way the house suddenly felt twice as large and completely empty. Around 6 in the morning, both boys woke up at the same time. Noah started first, a soft, restless cry from the bassinet beside the couch. Caleb followed a few seconds later, louder, more impatient. I lifted them one by one, settling into the familiar routine. Bottle, burp cloth, gentle rocking. Life with twins doesn't stop for heartbreak. Diapers still need changing. Bottles still need warming. Tiny bodies still need to be held. So I moved through the motions. Quietly. Mechanically. Outside, the sun was just beginning to rise over our street. The same street where, just a day earlier, I thought I had a normal life. By 8 o'clock, the house looked exactly the same as it always did. Bottles drying by the sink. Baby blankets folded on the couch. The soft hum of the washing machine running a load of tiny clothes. The only thing missing was him. He came back around noon. I heard his car pull into the driveway while I was sitting on the living room floor with the boys. They were lying on a play mat, kicking their little legs in the air the way babies do when they're happy for no reason at all. For a moment, I just sat there listening. The engine shut off. A car door closed. Slow footsteps on the front porch. My heart was beating harder than it should have been. Then the door opened. He walked in carrying 2 large suitcases. Not a backpack. Not a few clothes. Suitcases. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't realized the night before. He hadn't decided to leave suddenly. He had already packed. The boys noticed him immediately. Caleb turned his head toward the door, blinking with curiosity. Noah started waving his arms excitedly, the way babies do when they recognize a familiar face. For a second, I wondered if seeing them would change his mind. If something inside him would wake up. He looked at them, just for a moment. Then he looked away. "Hi," he said quietly. It sounded like he was greeting a neighbor, not the mother of his children. I nodded once. "Your things are upstairs." We didn't argue. We didn't shout. The silence between us felt heavier than any fight could have. While he went upstairs, I stayed on the floor with the boys, pretending to focus on their toys. But every small sound from above carried through the house. Closet doors opening. drawers sliding shut, the dull thud of shoes being placed inside a suitcase. Each sound felt like a page being torn out of my life. Underscore after about 20 minutes, he came back down. Both suitcases were full now. He set them beside the front door. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the night before. Did something happen? He frowned slightly. What do you mean? This, I said, gesturing around the room. You leaving? It doesn't make sense. His expression closed off immediately. People change, he said. People change. That was the explanation. 10 years of marriage reduced to 3 words. I looked at him carefully. Did your mother say something to you? For the first time, he looked irritated. This has nothing to do with my mom. The speed of that answer caught my attention. Too fast. Too rehearsed. But before I could say anything else, Noah started crying again, and the moment passed. Underscore. He picked up his suitcases and moved toward the door. Then he hesitated. Just slightly. Take care of yourself, he said. Not take care of the boys. Take care of yourself. And then he was gone. Again. The front door closed. His car started. And just like that, the life I had known for a decade disappeared down the street. The days that followed blurred together. Raising twins alone is like trying to run a marathon while carrying 2 small backpacks that never come off. Every hour demanded something. Feeding, bathing, laundry, doctor appointments, more feeding, more diapers. There was no time to sit and think about what had happened. But late at night, when the house finally went quiet, my mind always wandered back to the same question. Why? Not just why he left, but why it happened the way it did. Because the more I thought about it, the less it felt like a spontaneous decision. My husband had never been impulsive. He was the kind of man who researched refrigerators for 2 weeks before buying one. But leaving his wife and newborn sons? That happened overnight. It didn't add up. About a week later, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a name I had been expecting. Linda, my mother-in-law. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Hello. Her voice sounded perfectly calm. I just wanted to check on you, she said. The sweetness in her tone felt strange. Too smooth. I'm managing, I replied. There was a short pause. Then she said something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Well, sometimes these things are for the best. For the best. My husband leaving his newborn sons was for the best. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked down at Noah and Caleb sleeping in their bassinets. And in that quiet moment, a thought formed in my mind that I couldn't shake. Linda didn't sound surprised that her son had left. She sounded satisfied. And the more I replayed that phone call in my head over the following days, the more one uncomfortable possibility began to grow. What if she hadn't just known about his decision? What if she had helped create it? The first few weeks after my husband left were the hardest. Not because of the work. I was already used to hard work. Anyone raising newborn twins learns quickly that exhaustion becomes part of daily life. You function on very little sleep. You learn to hold one baby while preparing a bottle for the other. You master the quiet art of rocking 2 tiny bodies at the same time. The hard part was the silence. A house built for 2 adults suddenly felt very large when only one voice remained. At night, after feeding the boys, I would sit on the couch with them sleeping beside me and listen to the quiet. No footsteps in the hallway. No late-night conversations in the kitchen. No one asking if I needed help. Just the soft breathing of 2 babies. And my thoughts. For during the day, I tried not to think about the past. There simply wasn't time. Noah and Caleb were growing quickly. Their personalities were already starting to show in small ways. Noah was the calmer one. He liked being held and would often fall asleep with his tiny hand wrapped around my finger. Caleb was louder, more curious. He kicked constantly, like he was trying to run before he could even crawl. They kept me busy from morning to night. But every once in a while, something would happen that reminded me how much had changed. One afternoon, for example, I was at the grocery store pushing the stroller down the baby aisle. A young couple stood nearby with their newborn. The father was carefully reading the label on a container of formula while the mother held the baby against her shoulder. They were laughing about something small, probably nothing important. But watching them felt like looking through a window into a life I used to have. I turned the stroller and walked to the next aisle before they noticed me staring. Underscore. My husband sent money once. Just once. 2 weeks after he left, a small transfer appeared in my bank account. There was no message attached to it. No phone call. No explanation. Just the deposit. I remember staring at the number on my phone screen for a long time. It was enough to cover groceries for a few weeks. Maybe a month if I was careful. But what struck me the most wasn't the amount. It was the silence that came with it. No question about the boys. No request for photos. No curiosity about how they were growing. Nothing. It was as if he had simply closed the door and decided not to look back. For Linda, on the other hand, called twice more. Both times, her voice carried the same calm tone. Polite. Controlled. Almost cheerful. The second call happened about 3 weeks after my husband left. "How are the babies?" she asked. "They're healthy," I replied. "That's good," she said quickly. "Children are resilient." Resilient. The word stayed with me long after the conversation ended. She spoke about the situation as if it were some kind of unavoidable event, like a storm passing through town, not something her own son had chosen to do. At one point during the call, she said something else that caught my attention. "You're young," she told me. "You'll figure things out." It was an odd thing to say. Not cruel exactly, but not sympathetic either. More like someone offering advice to a stranger they had no real connection to. After that second phone call, I started thinking more seriously about the past. About the years leading up to that night. Memory is a strange thing. At first, when something painful happens, your mind focuses only on the moment itself. The shock. The sudden change. But as time passes, other memories begin to surface. Small moments. Comments that once seemed harmless. Conversations you didn't fully understand at the time. And when you look at them again, they start to form a pattern. I remembered a conversation from about a year before the twins were born. We had been visiting Linda for dinner. My husband had stepped outside to take a phone call, leaving the two of us alone at the kitchen table. She poured herself another glass of wine and looked at me with that familiar polite smile. "You know," she said, "raising children changes everything." I nodded. At the time, we were only thinking about starting a family. "It can put a lot of pressure on a marriage," she continued. I assumed she was offering advice. Maybe even concern. But then she added something that felt strange. Not every couple survives that kind of pressure. I remember laughing lightly, trying to keep the conversation comfortable. "We'll manage," I said. She didn't laugh back. Instead, she simply took another sip of her wine and said quietly, "I suppose we'll see." For at the time, I didn't think much about that moment. But now, sitting in my living room months later with 2 sleeping babies beside me, the memory felt different. Sharper. More deliberate. Linda had always spoken in careful sentences. Words chosen very precisely. And the more I replayed our past conversations in my mind, the more a quiet suspicion began to grow. What if she had never believed our marriage would last? Not just believed. What if she had been waiting for it to fail? As of course, suspicion is not the same thing as proof. At that point, I still had no real evidence that Linda had anything to do with my husband leaving. Only instincts. And instincts can be wrong. So I focused on the only thing I could control. Raising my sons. Day by day, the boys grew stronger. Their cries became louder. Their smiles appeared more often. Slowly, the house that once felt empty began to feel full again. Not the same kind of full, but full in a different way. A quieter way. Months passed. Then one afternoon, something happened that shifted everything. I was folding laundry in the living room while Noah and Caleb played on the floor beside me. The television was on in the background, tuned to a local daytime talk show I barely paid attention to. The host was talking about family relationships, about parents and adult children. about the influence that families can have on marriages. Normally, I would have ignored it. But then the host said something that made me stop folding the tiny shirts in my hands. She said, "Sometimes the biggest problems in a marriage don't come from the couple themselves, but from the people standing behind them." I looked up at the television, and for the first time since my husband walked out that door, I started to wonder if the real story behind my marriage hadn't even begun to reveal itself yet. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. Sometimes the biggest problems in a marriage don't come from the couple themselves, but from the people standing behind them. The host on the television said it casually, like it was just another talking point in a daytime discussion. But for me, the words landed differently. I sat there on the couch, a tiny onesie still folded halfway in my hands, while Noah and Caleb rolled around on the play mat in front of me. People standing behind them. The phrase kept repeating in my mind. Because if I was honest with myself, there had always been someone standing behind our marriage. Linda, underscore for most of my relationship with my husband, I tried very hard not to see it. When you're young and in love, you want to believe that family tension is normal. That disagreements with in-laws are just part of marriage. Everyone says that, don't they? You're not just marrying the person, you're marrying their family. So whenever Linda made a comment that felt slightly cold, I told myself it wasn't important. Whenever she criticized something small, how I cooked, how I decorated the house, even how I folded laundry, I told myself she was just being particular. Whenever she compared me to other women my husband had dated before we met, I told myself she was just reminiscing. Looking back now, I realize how carefully I ignored the pattern. One memory in particular started resurfacing around that time. It happened about 2 months before the twins were born. At that point, my pregnancy was already very difficult. Carrying twins puts a lot of pressure on the body, and by the 3rd trimester, I was exhausted most of the time. One afternoon, Linda came over to visit. My husband had invited her without telling me beforehand. I remember hearing her car pull into the driveway while I was lying on the couch with a pillow under my back. She walked into the house carrying a small gift bag. "For the babies," she said. Inside were 2 tiny blue blankets. They were beautiful, soft, expensive fabric with delicate stitching along the edges. I thanked her sincerely, but the moment that stayed with me didn't happen until later. We were sitting at the kitchen table while my husband was outside mowing the lawn. Linda watched me carefully as I poured myself a glass of water. "You must be very tired," she said. "I am," I admitted with a small laugh. "Twins are a lot." She nodded slowly. "Yes, they are." For a moment, she didn't say anything else. She just studied my face in that quiet, thoughtful way she sometimes had. Then she asked a question that felt strange. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" I frowned slightly. "Ready for what?" "All of it," she said. "Motherhood, marriage, responsibility." Her tone was calm, almost curious. But the question caught me off guard. "Of course I am," I replied. "Why wouldn't I be?" She shrugged lightly. "Oh, I don't know," she said. "It's just that my son has always had a very comfortable life." Comfortable. That word again. "He works very hard," I said carefully. "Yes," she agreed. "But he's never really had to struggle." Then she leaned back slightly in her chair and said something that I didn't fully understand at the time. "Struggle changes people." Back then, I thought she was simply worried about how the stress of raising twins might affect our relationship. It seemed like a reasonable concern. Now, sitting in my living room months later, that conversation sounded different in my memory. Less like concern, more like prediction. Back then, the more I thought about it, the more details started coming back. Linda had always been very involved in my husband's life. She called him almost every day. She asked about every decision we made, big or small. When we bought our house, she insisted on visiting multiple times during the process. When we chose furniture, she had opinions about everything. And when we told her about the twins, she suddenly became even more interested. But not in the way most grandmothers do. She rarely asked about the babies themselves. Instead, she asked questions about money, about work, about how we planned to manage everything. Underscore 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 one evening, about a month before my husband left, I overheard a phone conversation between the two of them. I wasn't trying to listen. I had just walked into the hallway while he was standing in the kitchen talking on the phone. At first, I didn't even realize he was speaking to his mother. Then I heard him say something that made me stop. "I know, Mom," he said quietly. There was a pause. Then he added, "It's not that simple." Another pause. His voice became more tense. "No, I understand what you're saying." I remember standing there in the hallway for a few seconds, unsure if I should interrupt. Then he lowered his voice and said something I barely caught. "You don't know her like I do." Her. He was talking about me. Underscore 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 underscore. When he noticed me standing there, he ended the call quickly. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "Just work stuff." Work stuff. At the time, I believed him. But thinking back now, that conversation didn't sound like work. It sounded like advice. Or persuasion. Underscore 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 underscore. Of course, even with all these memories returning, I still didn't have proof. Just pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together yet. So I kept doing what I had been doing since the day my husband left. I focused on my sons. I built a routine. Morning feedings. Afternoon walks with the stroller. Late night rocking when one of them couldn't sleep. Life slowly moved forward. Months turned into almost a year. The boys learned to crawl, then stand, then take their first wobbly steps across the living room floor. And through all of it, my husband never came back. Not once. Underscore 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 underscore. But the strange thing about life is that sometimes the truth waits quietly in the background. For the right moment. For the right circumstance. For the right person to finally notice something that was hidden all along. And in our case, that moment would arrive in the most unexpected way possible. On a television screen. And when it did, my husband would finally see something his mother had worked very hard to keep him from noticing. About a year passed after my husband left. Life didn't magically become easier. Raising two small boys on my own meant every day started early and ended late. But little by little, Noah and Caleb began to fill the house with a different kind of energy. They were walking by then. Wobbly little steps across the living room floor, arms stretched out for balance, laughing every time they fell down. Their laughter changed the atmosphere of the house. The silence that once felt heavy slowly turned into something lighter. Not happy in the way my old life had been, but peaceful in a quieter way. We had a routine. Morning breakfast together at the small kitchen table. A stroller walk around the neighborhood park in the afternoon. Bath time before bed, followed by the familiar struggle of getting two energetic toddlers to sleep. It wasn't the life I imagined when I married my husband, but it was a life, and it belonged to the three of us. Underscore 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 underscore. During that year, I almost never heard from him. There were no visits, no birthday cards, not even a phone call on the twins' first birthday. At first, that hurt more than I expected. I remember sitting on the living room floor surrounded by balloons and small wrapped gifts from friends and neighbors. Noah was trying to pull the ribbon off one of the boxes while Caleb kept poking at the birthday cake with his fingers. They were laughing. They had no idea their father wasn't there. But I knew. And that empty space at the table felt impossible to ignore. After that day, though, something inside me changed. I stopped waiting. Underscore 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 Linda also stopped calling. After those first few polite conversations months earlier, her voice disappeared from my life as well. No messages. No questions about the boys. Nothing. At first, I found that strange. But over time, I realized something important. Silence can also be a kind of answer. Underscore 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 underscore. About 14 months after my husband left, something unexpected happened. It started with a phone call. I was in the kitchen trying to convince Noah and Caleb to eat their lunch. Toddlers have a unique ability to turn mealtime into a negotiation. One wanted crackers instead of vegetables. The other insisted on throwing peas on the floor just to see where they would land. In the middle of this small chaos, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. The number was unfamiliar. But something made me pick it up anyway. Hello. A cheerful voice responded immediately. Hi, is this Emily? Yes, I said cautiously. My name is Karen, and I'm calling from Channel 7 News. For a moment, I thought she had the wrong number. But she continued speaking before I could say anything. We're producing a short segment about single parents in our community, she explained. Your name came up through a local support group. I frowned slightly, glancing at the twins who were now trying to climb out of their chairs. A segment? Yes, she said. We're highlighting stories of parents who are raising children on their own, especially families with unique challenges. Someone mentioned that you're raising twins by yourself. I stayed quiet for a moment. The truth was, I rarely talked about my personal situation outside of close friends. But a few months earlier, I had joined a small support group for single parents at a local community center. Apparently, someone there had mentioned my story. We'd love to interview you, Karen continued. Nothing too personal. Just a short conversation about your experience. I looked down at Noah, who had just managed to smear mashed carrots across the tray of his chair. Part of me wanted to say no. I wasn't used to being in front of cameras. And I certainly didn't want to turn my life into some kind of dramatic story for television. But another part of me hesitated. Because during the past year, I had met several other single mothers in that support group. Women who were struggling even more than I was. Some of them had no family nearby. Some were working 2 jobs just to afford childcare. If a short interview could show that reality to people, maybe it wasn't such a bad thing. How long would the interview take? I asked. About 30 minutes, Karen said. We could even film part of it at your home if you're comfortable with that. I glanced around my living room. Toys scattered across the floor. Tiny socks draped over the couch. A stroller parked near the door. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And honesty felt important. Okay, I said slowly. We can do it. Underscore. The filming happened 2 weeks later. A small crew arrived at my house one afternoon with cameras and bright lights that made the living room look very different from usual. Noah and Caleb were fascinated by everything. They followed the cameraman around the room like curious little shadows, occasionally waving at the lens as if they understood they were part of something unusual. Karen sat across from me in a chair while the camera recorded our conversation. She asked simple questions. What was it like raising twins alone? What were the hardest moments? What kept me going when things felt overwhelming? I answered honestly. Not dramatically, just honestly. I talked about sleepless nights. About learning to do everything on my own. About the way children can surprise you with their strength even when they're very small. But one thing I did very carefully during that interview was this. I never spoke badly about my husband. Not once. When Karen gently asked what happened between us, I simply said, sometimes people leave when life becomes more complicated than they expected. That was all. No anger. No blame. Just a simple sentence. A few weeks later, the segment aired on local television. I almost forgot about it, actually. Life with 2 toddlers doesn't leave much time for watching daytime news. But somewhere across the city, someone else was watching that broadcast. Someone who hadn't seen me or the twins in over a year. And when he looked at the screen that day, for the first time since he walked out of our house, my husband finally saw the life he had left behind. A few days after the TV segment aired, I didn't notice anything unusual at first. Life with 2 toddlers has a way of keeping you completely focused on the present moment. Breakfast spills, toy trucks crashing into table legs, tiny socks disappearing somewhere in the laundry basket. Those things fill up most of the day. Noah had recently learned how to open the lower kitchen cabinets. Caleb had discovered the joy of stacking blocks and knocking them over with dramatic enthusiasm. So when the television interview aired that afternoon, I didn't even watch it live. A friend texted me later that evening. I just saw you on Channel 7, she wrote. You did great. I smiled when I read the message, but I didn't think much about it. To me, the interview was just a small moment. A short conversation about parenting. 30 minutes of filming that had been reduced to a few minutes of television. Life moved on. At least for me. But somewhere across town, that same television segment was playing in a completely different house. A house where my husband had been living since he walked out of our front door. I didn't know exactly where he was at the time. All I knew was that he had moved into an apartment closer to his workplace. One of the few pieces of information that had reached me through mutual acquaintances. Apparently, That afternoon he had come home from work earlier than usual. The television was on in the background while he made dinner. And by pure coincidence, Channel 7 was playing in the living room. Underscore the segment started with a short introduction from the host. A simple topic, local families, single parents, and the quiet strength it takes to raise children on your own. Then the camera cut to footage of my living room. The same couch. The same toys scattered across the floor. And then my face appeared on the screen. At first, he probably thought he was mistaken. After all, more than a year had passed since the last time he saw me. Time has a way of changing small details, hair length, expressions, the way someone carries themselves. But then the camera shifted, and Noah ran into the frame. Right behind him, Caleb followed, laughing as he tried to grab one of his brother's toys. Two little boys. Dark hair. The same eyes he had seen when they were newborns. The reporter's voice spoke calmly over the footage. Emily has been raising her twin sons on her own for over a year. The camera returned to the interview. I was sitting in the same chair, answering the questions Karen had asked that afternoon. The words were simple. I talked about long nights. About learning to solve problems by myself. About the small victories that come with raising children. At one point the reporter asked the question that had made me pause during filming. What happened to the boy's father? On the screen, I took a slow breath before answering. Sometimes people leave when life becomes more complicated than they expected. That was all I said. No anger. No accusations. Just the truth. For someone watching casually, the segment probably lasted less than 4 minutes. But for my husband, those 4 minutes must have felt very different. Because as the footage continued, something else became clear. The boys were healthy, happy, laughing. The camera caught Noah climbing onto my lap, while Caleb tried to pull one of the microphones off the table. I remember laughing during that moment of the interview. The reporter laughed too. It was an ordinary, slightly chaotic scene that anyone with small children would recognize. But for someone who had walked away from that life, it must have been strange to see. The final part of the segment showed us walking through the neighborhood park. The camera followed us from behind as the twins ran ahead across the grass, their tiny legs moving as fast as they could manage. The reporter's voice spoke again. Emily says the hardest part of raising twins alone isn't the work. It's the responsibility of showing them what strength looks like. Then the clip ended. The program moved on to the next story. Just another segment in the daily news. The image on that screen didn't disappear from my husband's mind. Not right away. Because something about what he had just seen didn't match the version of events he had believed for the past year. According to the story he had been told, I wasn't supposed to be doing well. I was supposed to be overwhelmed, bitter, struggling. At least, that's what someone had led him to believe. The woman on the television looked calm. The children looked safe. And the story being told didn't include the anger he might have expected. Just quiet resilience. Later that evening, after the program ended, my husband sat in his living room staring at the dark screen. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. And for the first time in a very long time, a question began to form in his mind. A simple question. One that hadn't occurred to him the night he packed his suitcases, or the months that followed. But now, after seeing us on that television screen, it became impossible to ignore. What if the story he had been told about his own family wasn't the full truth? That question stayed in my husband's mind long after the television went dark. At first, he tried to ignore it. People do that sometimes when a thought feels uncomfortable. They push it aside and distract themselves with something else. Work, music, a phone call, anything that keeps the mind from digging too deeply. But some questions are stubborn. They sit quietly in the back of your thoughts and wait. And the more my husband replayed that television segment in his head, the more that question kept returning. What if the story he had believed for the past year wasn't the full truth? The version of events he had accepted was very clear. According to his mother, our marriage had been falling apart for a long time. She had told him I was overwhelmed by the pregnancy. She said I was becoming distant, unhappy, difficult to live with. She told him that the twins had changed everything about our relationship, that I had grown cold toward him, that our home had become tense and miserable. And over time, those repeated conversations had shaped the way he saw things. Small disagreements between us started to look bigger than they were. Moments of stress, perfectly normal for two people expecting twins, began to feel like signs of something worse. Little by little, doubt had settled into his mind. And when the twins were born, that doubt only grew stronger. That's what Linda had explained to him. She said some marriages simply couldn't survive that kind of pressure. She said he needed to think about his future, about his happiness, about the kind of life he deserved. At the time, those words had sounded reasonable, comforting even, especially when they came from someone he trusted his entire life. His mother. But now, sitting alone in his apartment after seeing us on television, the story suddenly didn't feel as solid as it once did. Because the woman he had just watched on that screen didn't match the picture his mother had painted. She didn't look bitter. She didn't look unstable. She didn't look like someone who had destroyed a marriage. She looked steady, calm, focused on her children. And the boys themselves looked nothing like the burden he had once imagined. They looked happy, healthy, full of energy. That contrast bothered him. Enough that later that evening, he did something he hadn't done in over a year. He opened the old box in his closet. Inside were things he hadn't looked at since the night he moved out. A few photo albums, some paperwork from our house, and his old phone, the one he had replaced shortly after leaving. The battery was almost dead, but it still turned on. And when it did, something unexpected happened. Old messages began appearing on the screen. Conversations from months and even years earlier. Texts between us about groceries, doctor appointments, small daily plans. Normal things. The kind of messages couples send when they share a life together. At first he scrolled through them without thinking much. But then something caught his attention. A conversation from the week before the twins were born. He remembered that week very clearly. It had been stressful. I was in pain most of the time because of the pregnancy, and we had spent several days preparing the house for the babies. His mother had also been calling frequently during that time, offering advice, asking questions, reminding him how difficult things were about to become. He scrolled further down the messages. Then he stopped. There, in the middle of the conversation, was something he had completely forgotten. A message I had sent him late one evening while he was still at work. It said, "Your mom stopped by today." He stared at the screen for a moment. Then he kept reading. "She said some strange things. I think she's worried about us." That message was followed by another one a few minutes later. I told her we're fine. But the conversation felt odd. My husband frowned. He didn't remember that message. At least, not clearly. But as he read it again, a faint memory returned. He remembered glancing at the text while sitting at his desk at work. At the time, he had been busy, tired, distracted by everything happening around the upcoming birth of the twins. So he had responded quickly. His reply appeared just below my message. "I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it." He leaned back in his chair and stared at the phone. Because suddenly, another memory surfaced. That same evening, his mother had called him. A long conversation. One that had left him feeling uneasy at the time. She had spoken about responsibility. About how difficult life with twins could become. About how some couples discover too late that they aren't truly compatible. Back then, he thought she was simply worried about him. Now, looking back at those messages, the timing felt strange. Too close together. Too convenient. And for the first time since the night he packed his suitcases, another possibility crossed his mind. What if the doubts he felt about his marriage hadn't started on their own? What if someone had carefully placed those doubts there, one conversation at a time? That thought unsettled him enough that the next morning, he decided to do something he hadn't done in over a year. He picked up his phone, scrolled to a familiar name, and pressed call. Linda answered after the second ring. Her voice sounded cheerful as always. "Hello, sweetheart." But this time, my husband didn't return the warmth in her tone. Instead, he asked a question she clearly wasn't expecting. "Mom," he said slowly, "why did you tell me Emily didn't want me around the babies?" The moment my husband asked that question, the line went quiet. Not the normal kind of silence. Not the pause people take when they're thinking about how to answer. This silence felt different. Longer. He could hear the faint background noise on the other end of the phone. The soft clinking of dishes, maybe a television playing somewhere in the house. Then Linda finally spoke. "What are you talking about?" she said calmly. Her tone was light, almost amused. But my husband knew his mother well enough to recognize when she was avoiding something. "You told me Emily didn't want me around the babies," he repeated. "Remember?" Another short pause. "Oh," Linda said softly. That. The way she said it made the memory suddenly feel very real again. The conversation he was remembering had happened a few days after the twins were born. At the time, everything in our house had been chaotic. Newborn twins don't follow schedules. They cry at different times, wake up at different times, and somehow always seem to need something at the exact same moment. My husband had been exhausted. He was trying to balance work with the new responsibilities at home. And during that stressful week, his mother had called him several times, offering advice, offering concern, offering opinions. One of those calls had happened late at night. He remembered sitting in the car outside the house after coming home from work. The engine was still running while he talked to her on the phone. "She's shutting you out," Linda had said quietly. "What do you mean?" he had asked. "She didn't even call you when the babies started crying earlier today." Linda replied, "I was there. She handled everything herself." At the time, that statement sounded reasonable. But what he didn't know then was something very simple. I hadn't called him because he was at work, and I didn't want to interrupt him. Now. Sitting in his apartment over a year later, my husband remembered that conversation very differently. "Why did you say that?" he asked his mother on the phone. "Say what?" Linda replied smoothly. "That Emily didn't want me involved." "Oh, sweetheart," she sighed gently. "You're remembering things incorrectly." Incorrectly. That word made his jaw tighten. "I remember the conversation," he said. "You said she was pushing me away." Linda's voice softened. "I was worried about you," she said. "You were under a lot of stress." "But that's not what I asked." The firmness in his voice surprised even him. For years, he had rarely questioned his mother's version of things. But something about seeing us on that television screen had shifted something inside him. He couldn't ignore the doubts anymore. For Mom, he said carefully. "Did Emily ever tell you she didn't want me around the boys?" There was another pause. This one slightly longer. "Well, not exactly," Linda admitted. My husband sat up straighter in his chair. "Not exactly?" "I could just see how overwhelmed she was," Linda continued. "Sometimes women get protective after having children. That's not the same thing." "I was only trying to help you," she said quickly. That sentence sounded familiar. Too familiar. Because as the conversation continued, something else became clear to him. Every time he asked a direct question, Linda answered with something slightly different. A new explanation. A softer version of the same story. But never a clear answer. After a few minutes of this, my husband said something that caught her off guard. "I saw Emily and the boys on TV yesterday." This time, the silence was immediate. Linda didn't respond right away. And that hesitation said more than words ever could. "Oh," she said finally. Just that one word. "Oh, you didn't mention that earlier," she added. "No," my husband replied. "I didn't." He leaned forward slightly in his chair. "They looked happy." Linda gave a small laugh. "Well, of course they did. It's television. They looked healthy. I'm sure they are." They didn't look like they were struggling the way you said they would. Now, the warmth in Linda's voice disappeared. Just slightly. You can't believe everything you see on television, she said coolly. Underscore. That response bothered him more than anything else she had said. Because the truth was very simple. The television segment hadn't shown anything dramatic. Just a mother and two children living their everyday life. No complaints. No accusations. Just reality. And that reality didn't match the picture his mother had described for over a year. For Mom, he said slowly. Did you ever tell Emily that I didn't want the twins? Another pause. This time, the answer came quickly. Of course not. But something in her tone made him uneasy. Because he suddenly remembered another moment. Another conversation. A brief argument between us just a few days before he left. At the time, I had said something that confused him. You don't even want them, I had told him quietly. Back then, he thought I was just emotional from exhaustion. But now, hearing his mother's careful answers on the phone, the memory sounded different. For Mom, he said again, his voice lower now. Did you talk to Emily when I wasn't around? Linda didn't answer immediately, and in that moment, my husband felt something shift inside him. A small crack in the story he had believed for so long. Because for the first time, he began to realize something deeply unsettling. What if the tension between his wife and his mother hadn't been an accident? What if someone had been standing in the middle the entire time, making sure both sides heard a slightly different story? On the other end of the phone, Linda stayed quiet for a few seconds. For most people, a pause like that might not mean much. But my husband had known his mother his entire life. And he understood something about her that most people didn't notice. Linda was never quiet unless she was thinking carefully about what to say next. Finally, she spoke. Of course I talked to Emily, she said calmly. She was my daughter-in-law. That answer sounded harmless. Normal, even. But my husband didn't let the moment pass. What did you say to her, he asked. Oh, the usual things, Linda replied lightly. Advice. Support. Support. The word felt strangely misplaced in that conversation. Because as he thought back over the past year, one thing became very clear. Emily had never once mentioned receiving support from Linda. Not once. For Did you ever tell her that I didn't want the twins? He asked again. This time Linda sighed. The sound carried a small hint of irritation. Why are you suddenly asking all these questions? She said. Because something doesn't make sense. What doesn't make sense? The way everything happened, he replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Linda said something that immediately made him uneasy. You're overthinking this. That was always her favorite phrase whenever he questioned something she said. You're overthinking. You're imagining things. You're remembering it wrong. Small sentences that quietly pushed the conversation in another direction. But this time, my husband didn't move away from the question. Instead, he asked something even more direct. Did you tell Emily that I didn't want to raise the boys? The silence that followed was longer than any of the others. When Linda finally spoke again, her voice sounded slightly sharper. I might have said you were feeling overwhelmed. That's not the same thing. Well, you were overwhelmed, she replied quickly. He rubbed his forehead. Yes, I was tired, he admitted. We had newborn twins. Everyone would be tired. That's exactly my point. But I never said I didn't want them. Linda didn't respond. For in that quiet moment, another memory surfaced in my husband's mind. A conversation between him and me about 2 days before he left the house. I had been standing in the kitchen holding one of the babies. My voice had been calm, but there was something hurt underneath it. If you don't want this life, I said quietly, you should just say it. At the time, he had been confused. I never said that, he told me. You didn't have to, I replied. Now, sitting alone in his apartment with the phone still pressed to his ear, that moment suddenly made more sense. Because if his mother had told me that he didn't want the twins, and told him that I didn't want him involved, then both sides would have believed the other was pulling away. For Mom, he said slowly. Did you tell Emily that I didn't want the boys? Linda let out a long breath. Sweetheart, she said gently, you're focusing on the wrong details. The wrong details? Yes. The truth is that marriage wasn't working. That sentence sounded too polished, too prepared, almost like something she had repeated many times before. But now my husband was starting to hear the gaps between the words. Wasn't working for who? He asked. For both of you, Linda replied. But Emily never said that. How would you know? She said quickly. The question hit him harder than she expected. Because the honest answer was simple. He wouldn't know. He had never asked. Underscore. That realization settled over him like a weight. For more than a year, he had accepted the story exactly as it was presented to him. He believed his marriage had been falling apart. He believed Emily had become distant. He believed leaving was the only realistic option. But looking back now, he couldn't remember a single direct conversation where Emily actually said she wanted him gone. Not one. Most of those ideas had come from somewhere else. From quiet comments. From worried phone calls. From his mother's voice telling him what she believed was happening. For Mom, he said again, his voice quieter now. Why didn't you tell me Emily was doing okay? Linda sounded genuinely confused. What do you mean? You told me she was struggling, he said. You told me she couldn't handle everything. Well, raising twins alone is difficult. That's not what I asked. He leaned forward in his chair, staring at the blank wall across the room. You said she was falling apart. Another pause. Then Linda gave a soft laugh. Oh, sweetheart. That's just how she wanted to appear in front of you. That answer didn't make sense. Not after what he had just seen on television. Not after watching Emily calmly talk about raising the boys. Not after seeing the children laughing and running through the park. For the first time during the conversation, frustration slipped into his voice. That's not what it looked like. Linda didn't respond immediately. When she did, her tone was cooler than before. Well, television edits things. That was the second time she had said something like that. As if the entire interview had been some kind of illusion. But the truth was simple. The interview had shown exactly what life looked like. A mother raising 2 children. Working through challenges. Moving forward. And suddenly, another uncomfortable thought formed in my husband's mind. If his mother had been wrong about that, then what else had she been wrong about? Or worse, what if she hadn't been wrong at all? What if she had been carefully shaping the story the entire time? The idea made his chest tighten. Because if that was true, then the night he packed his suitcases, the night he walked out of the house, the night he left his wife and 2 newborn sons behind, might not have been the simple decision he thought it was. It might have been something else entirely. Something that had been quietly guided in that direction, long before he ever realized it. The silence after that thought felt heavier than anything else my husband had experienced that night. Because once the idea appeared in his mind, it refused to disappear. If his mother had shaped the story, if she had been quietly guiding both sides of the conversation, then the collapse of his marriage might not have been an accident. It might have been a result. A slow result. One small comment at a time. For Mom, he said carefully. When did Emily tell you she didn't want me involved with the twins? Linda answered almost immediately. She didn't say it like that. Then how did she say it? She said she needed space. That explanation sounded simple. But something about it didn't feel complete. Because my husband remembered something very clearly. Emily had never been the type of person who spoke indirectly. If she wanted space, she would have said exactly that. And she would have said it to him. Not to his mother. What exactly did she say? He asked. On the other end of the phone, Linda shifted slightly. I don't remember the exact words. But you remember the meaning? Yes. And the meaning was that she didn't want me there? She said things were easier when she handled the boys herself. That sentence hung in the air between them. For a second, my husband simply stared at the floor. Because now another memory came back to him. A moment from those exhausting first weeks after the twins were born. Emily standing in the nursery late at night. One baby crying. The other just beginning to wake up. He had tried to help, but he had picked up the wrong bottle, mixed the formula incorrectly, and Emily had laughed softly and said something that suddenly sounded very different now. Sometimes it's just easier if I do it. At the time, he thought she meant the moment. Just that moment. Not the entire future. For Mom, he said slowly. That doesn't mean she wanted me gone. Linda didn't answer right away. Instead, she gave another quiet sigh. You're rewriting the past, she said. No, he replied. I'm trying to understand it. Sweetheart, you're only questioning things now because you saw her on television. That's not true. Then why didn't you question it before? The question hit its target. Because the honest answer was uncomfortable. He trusted his mother. For his entire life, she had been the person he went to when something didn't make sense. When he was younger, she helped him understand teachers, friends, girlfriends, even his first job. Her voice had always sounded calm, reasonable, protective. So when his marriage started becoming difficult, he listened to her. I thought you were helping, he admitted quietly. I was helping, Linda replied quickly. Helping who? Her answer came a second later. You. But for the first time in his life, that answer didn't feel completely convincing. Because if she had been helping him, why did the result look like this? A small apartment, empty evenings, 2 sons he barely knew, and a wife he had stopped speaking to. For Mom, he said again. Did you ever tell Emily that I was thinking about leaving? There was a pause. Then Linda said something carefully. I might have mentioned that you were struggling. What does that mean? It means I told her you were under pressure. And you thought that would help? I thought she needed to understand. My husband leaned back in his chair, feeling something strange forming in his chest. Because that explanation created a new possibility. If his mother told Emily that he was thinking about leaving, and told him that Emily wanted distance, then both sides might have believed the relationship was already falling apart, even if neither of them had actually decided that. Did you ever tell her that I still wanted the marriage to work? He asked. Linda sounded surprised by the question. Well, you didn't say that to me. That doesn't mean I didn't feel it. Another pause. A longer one this time. Finally, Linda spoke again, but her tone had changed slightly. More defensive. You're acting like I caused your divorce. I didn't say that. But that's what you're implying. He rubbed his eyes slowly. I'm just trying to understand how everything ended so quickly. Things don't end quickly, she replied. They fall apart slowly. That sentence sounded wise, almost philosophical. But something about it now felt like a way to avoid answering the real question. Because one truth had become impossible to ignore. For an entire year, my husband had accepted the story exactly as it was given to him. Emily didn't want him involved. Emily needed space. Emily was happier handling things alone. But now he had seen her face. He had heard her voice. And none of those things matched the woman who calmly said on television, I didn't expect to raise twins alone, but once it happened, I knew I had to be strong for them. She never said she wanted to do it alone. She said it happened. For Mom, he asked one last time. Did Emily ever actually tell you she wanted me to leave? The silence that followed felt different from the others. Not thoughtful. Not calm. Uncomfortable. When Linda finally answered, her voice sounded slightly colder than before. You're chasing ghosts, she said. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you need. But it's not the truth. Another long pause filled the line. And in that moment, something small but important shifted in my husband's mind. For the first time since his marriage ended, he stopped assuming that the story he had been told was the real one. And once that doubt appeared, It opened the door to a possibility he had never seriously considered before. Maybe the person who truly knew the truth wasn't his mother. Maybe the only person who could actually explain what happened that year was Emily, the woman he had walked away from, the woman he hadn't spoken to in over 12 months, and the mother of the two boys who had just unknowingly reminded him of everything he left behind. The idea of calling Emily stayed in my husband's mind long after he ended the conversation with his mother. That night, he didn't sleep well. Every time he closed his eyes, pieces of the past kept rearranging themselves. Small conversations, small misunderstandings, things that once felt clear, now looked different. Because if his mother had changed even a few words between them, then the entire story of how the marriage ended might not be accurate. The next morning, my husband woke up earlier than usual. He made coffee, but barely drank it. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table staring at his phone. Emily's number was still saved in his contacts. He had never deleted it. He just never used it. For more than a year, that number had been sitting there quietly, untouched, almost like a door he refused to open. He picked up the phone, then put it back down, then picked it up again, because he suddenly realized something uncomfortable. He didn't actually know what he was supposed to say. "Hi, Emily. I saw you on television yesterday, and now I think my mother may have lied to both of us." That didn't sound like a normal conversation. But the longer he sat there, the more one thought kept returning. If he didn't ask Emily, he would never know. And if he never knew, then the rest of his life would always carry the same question. What really happened? Finally, he pressed the call button. The phone rang once, then twice, then 3 times. With every ring, his chest felt tighter. Part of him expected the call to go to voicemail. But then, suddenly, the line clicked, and he heard a voice he hadn't heard in over a year. "Hello." Emily's voice sounded almost exactly the same. Calm, steady, just slightly cautious. For a moment, my husband didn't speak, because hearing her voice again made the distance between the past and the present feel very small. "Emily, it's me." There was a brief silence on the other end. Not shocked, not emotional, just quiet recognition. "I know," she said. It didn't know how to interpret that answer. Maybe she recognized his number. Maybe she had expected this call. Or maybe she had simply moved far enough forward in life that hearing from him no longer felt dramatic. "How are you?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it felt strangely heavy after so much time. "We're good," Emily replied. "We." Not I. "We." That word immediately reminded him of the twins. "How are the boys?" he asked carefully. "They're doing great." Her voice softened slightly when she talked about them. "They just turned 1 last month." He closed his eyes for a second, because that sentence carried something he hadn't experienced. An entire year of their lives. First smiles. First attempts at crawling. First words. Moments he had missed. "I saw you yesterday," he said quietly. "On television." Emily didn't seem surprised. "Yeah." The station asked if they could share our story. Our story. That phrase sounded strange to him, because for the past year, he had thought it was no longer his story, just hers. And the boys looked. He paused for a second, searching for the right word. "Happy." Emily gave a soft, almost amused exhale. "They are." Another brief silence followed. Then she asked the question that had probably been waiting since the beginning of the call. "So why are you calling?" My husband leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, because now he had reached the difficult part. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Okay. When we separated, did you tell my mom that you wanted me out of the house?" The question came out more directly than he expected. But sometimes direct questions are the only ones that matter. For a few seconds, Emily didn't respond. Then she said something very simple. "No, The word was immediate. Clear. No hesitation. No confusion. Just no. My husband felt a slow, uncomfortable realization begin forming again. Did you ever tell her that you didn't want me involved with the twins? Of course not, Emily said. This time her voice carried genuine surprise. Why would I say that? Because that's what she told me. Another pause followed. But this pause felt different from the ones during his conversation with his mother. This one sounded like someone trying to process new information. Underscore, she told you. I didn't want you around the boys. Emily asked slowly. Yes. Emily exhaled softly. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something that hadn't been there earlier. Confusion. Because from her perspective, the story had always sounded very different. That's strange, she said. Why? Because she told me something almost opposite. My husband's grip on the phone tightened slightly. What did she say? Emily answered carefully. She told me you were overwhelmed and thinking about leaving. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Because in that moment, both sides of the same story were finally sitting in the same conversation. Two completely different versions. Delivered by the same person. And for the first time, both Emily and my husband began to realize something deeply unsettling. The distance that destroyed their marriage might not have started between them. It might have started somewhere in the middle. Emily's words stayed in the air between them for several seconds. Because what she had just said didn't simply explain a misunderstanding. It revealed something much bigger. For more than a year, both of them had been living with completely different versions of the same story. My husband believed Emily had pushed him away. Emily believed he had chosen to leave. And right in the middle of those two stories stood the same person. His mother. Wait. My husband said slowly. She told you I wanted to leave? Yes. Emily's voice was steady, but there was a quiet tension behind it now. She said you were under a lot of pressure, that the babies were too much, and that you felt trapped. My husband leaned back in his chair. Because none of that had ever been true. I never said that, he replied. Emily was quiet again. Then she spoke carefully. She also told me something else. What? She said you felt like I didn't appreciate how hard you were working, and that you needed space. My husband rubbed his forehead. Because the more Emily spoke, the more the entire past year started to look different. He had never asked for space. He had asked for help. For balance. For time to figure things out together. I think, Emily said slowly. We both heard different things from the same person. And suddenly, the puzzle pieces finally started fitting together. Every argument, every misunderstanding, every moment where they both believed the other person had already given up. It hadn't started between them. It had been planted. Quietly. One conversation at a time. For neither of them spoke for a while. Because understanding the truth didn't immediately fix what had already happened. An entire year had passed. The twins had grown. Their lives had moved forward in separate directions. But at the same time, the anger that once filled that space between them suddenly felt misplaced. I'm sorry, my husband said quietly. The word surprised even him. Because he had spent a long time believing Emily was the one who owed him that apology. But now the picture was different. I should have talked to you directly, he continued. I should have asked you what was really going on. Emily didn't answer immediately. Then she said something simple. Yeah, we probably both should have. There was no bitterness in her voice. Just honesty. After that call, my husband didn't rush to fix everything overnight. Because some things take time. But something important had already changed. For the first time in more than a year, he and Emily were speaking to each other directly. Not through someone else. Not through assumptions. Just two people trying to understand what had happened. A few weeks later, something small but meaningful happened. Emily agreed to let him visit the twins. Not a dramatic reunion. Not a big emotional moment. Just a quiet afternoon at the park. When my husband arrived, the boys were sitting in a stroller near the playground. They were bigger now. Laughing. Curious about everything. And when Emily lifted them out one at a time and placed them in his arms, He realized something that television cameras never could have captured. Fatherhood wasn't something you watched from a distance. It was something you showed up for. Every day. From that point on, things moved slowly. But they moved in the right direction. My husband started visiting the twins regularly. Emily allowed space for those moments because she could see something important. He wasn't trying to rewrite the past. He was trying to show up for the future. And sometimes, that matters more. As for his mother, things changed there too. Because once the truth became clear, the trust that had once been automatic was no longer the same. My husband still spoke to her, but the blind belief he once had was gone, and in its place was something healthier. Boundaries. Months later, the local station aired a short follow-up story about Emily and the twins. This time, the focus wasn't just on the struggles she had overcome. It was about rebuilding, about how families sometimes break, and sometimes find a way to slowly repair. The camera caught a small moment at the end of the segment. The twins running across the grass. Emily standing nearby, and my husband kneeling down as the boys ran toward him. A quiet moment. Nothing dramatic. Just a father catching his sons in his arms. That night, when the program finished airing, Emily sent my husband a short message. Did you see it? He replied a few seconds later. Yeah. Then he added something else. Thank you for giving me another chance to be their dad. Emily didn't answer right away. But when she did, her message was simple. Just make sure you keep showing up. And that's how the story really ended. Not with revenge. Not with shouting. But with something far more powerful. The truth finally replacing the lies. And two parents realizing that sometimes the strongest thing a family can do is start again, one honest conversation at a time.